financing national defense policy and processes. And also he has written several interesting articles and chapters on defense industry. Nowadays, in the past, there are a lot of folks have been doing the defense industry. I did, several works on defense industry, but nowadays very few are paying attention to defense industry. But in South Korea now, whether to pursue defense industry continuously or not has become one of the big topic. For example, whether we should acquire our own combat fighters or not in the Air Force, and because of continuing threat from North Korea, our government has been putting a lot of emphasis on defense industry. But now, same old questions of scale of economy issues, latecomer in the defense industry, can we survive in international competition, etc. But now our T-50, now we call the KA, Korea Attack, fighter 50 has become kind of litmus test. It is with help of Lockheed Martin we developed it. Now we're trying to promote the export of that T-50. Depending on whether we can be successful or not, the future course of our defense industry will be determined. As a matter of fact, tomorrow, Yonsei University is holding 18th air power conference in the Gonggun-Hwaegan Air Force hall or center in Daewangdong. I organized that one 18 years ago, and I've been running that program 18 years. And as a matter of fact, one of the major themes of that conference is whether, in other words, production of air power related product in Korea, will it be an asset or liability? Will be the major theme. And we are very lucky to invite Mark to that conference. And since we wanted to introduce him to some other audience, because tomorrow all the Air Force related folks and defense related folks will be there, but not ordinary journalists and diplomats, commentators would be interested in that one. That is why I invited him over in here and to give a lecture on the topic, the South Korean and defense industry globalization. Curse or blessing. I put that in a subtitle. It's provocative. I did it in order to attract more audience. With this brief introduction, let me invite Dr. Mark Devore. Let's give big applause to him.
Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to present my research to you. Now, I actually greatly enjoyed the title that you proposed, Ambassador, in that it got me to think more concretely about how to apply the research I've done about defense industrial globalization, mainly as it applies to European, Middle Eastern, or the South African case, to the Korean case. And also, I greatly enjoy the slightly longer format that we have here, in that I can present research that is going to be that's in a little bit more of a preliminary stage than the research that I'll be presenting tomorrow at the Air Power Conference. Now, essentially, this is the structure of the presentation I'm going to make. I'm going to look at the challenge of combat aircraft production. This is going to look at past historic efforts by states to enter the relatively closed club of countries that develop and produce sophisticated combat aircraft. I'm going to then look at the three strategies of market entry that have consistently been used over time by states that have attempted to develop combat aircraft development and production capabilities. In the third part, I'm going to look at the obstacles to success that have historically led to at least 19 out of 20 previous efforts having failed. So the track record of success in countries establishing themselves at combat aircraft production is relatively low. Then I'm going to look at what globalization changes in terms of the opportunities that emerging defense producers have to finally trying to present some preliminary conclusions. And I greatly look forward to your feedback and questions. So, combat aircraft production. Now, as many of you know, the production of a modern combat aircraft is in defense industrial terms, probably the most difficult or the second most difficult task of systems integration, with nuclear submarines as potentially the only defense industrial challenge which is more difficult than producing a cutting-edge combat aircraft. Now, by the mid-1950s, 5 countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, France, and Sweden, had established capabilities to research, develop, and produce combat aircraft that were on the cutting edge of technology. Now, those 5 countries are still producing sophisticated combat aircraft today. Now, since then, a lot of countries have tried to join this club of 5. So far, in my own research, I've uncovered at least 18 countries have set out on dedicated efforts to penetrate this market of the production of cutting-edge combat aircraft. 2 states have attempted to do this on 2 occasions. Argentina and India both had projects early on in the 1950s and 1960s, and then reinitiated projects in the 1970s, 1980s. So therefore, one can say that there have been 20 distinct attempts at market entry. Of these, only one, that of the People's Republic of China, seems to arguably be a success at this moment. So this means that, even laying aside the fact that about 3 of these efforts, it's too early to say whether they've succeeded or failed, there's an abysmal record in terms of states attempting to enter the market of sophisticated combat aircraft production. Now, this is just to put some photos on some of the previous projects. The upper left-hand corner is the SEA 90. This was the sophisticated Argentine project of the late 1980s. The upper right-hand corner is the Avro Aero. It was a Canadian project of the late 1950s. The Canadians are still hung up about it and have produced both a film and a TV series to commemorate their effort to build the Avro Aero. On the lower left-hand corner is the Yugoslav Novi Avion. It was a project of the late 1980s. And in the lower right-hand corner, we have the first Indian project, the HF-24 Marut. And that's just to provide a little bit of visual, a few visuals to essentially the list that follows of national attempts, excluding the South Korean attempt that I haven't put on the list, of national efforts to develop sophisticated combat aircraft production capabilities from the 1940s until present.
Israeli one is the only case is what? Nabi case? What? Israel.
Which about the Israeli case?
Israel doesn't have any. No.
Israel has a very vibrant aerospace industry, but Israel gave up the ambition to produce sophisticated combat aircraft. Israel launched their project after the French embargoed them in 1968. Israel began by, I have a slide later that will go into this in greater depth, began by essentially trying to make unlicensed copies of French products and then gradually improved them. But in the mid-1980s, the Israelis were forced to cancel their last combat aircraft project. And since then, they've been a world leader in the production of drones, UAVs, missiles, and other aerospace products. But in terms of actual combat aircraft, the Israelis exited the market. So, leaving aside the People's Republic of China case that has a lot of sub-projects, at least 15 major projects were canceled without production. 5 national projects ended without the production of a single combat aircraft. More so than the projects that were canceled without any production whatsoever, a lot of substandard, uncompetitive aircraft resulted from these projects. At least 9 ground attack aircraft that were unsophisticated and, in market terms, unsellable were produced from these projects, and 4 uncompetitive fighter aircraft resulted from these 20-some projects. So, given that we have a data set of 20-some combat aircraft projects, it's worth looking at how countries tried to enter the market and how that compares to the South Korean experience. Now, basically, there's 4 ideal typical strategies that countries tried to pursue in developing combat aircraft production capabilities. The first was moving from a precursor industry, that's either a non-jet aircraft industry or the production of an aircraft under license, to bringing in foreign design, leadership, or project management skills from one of the 5 leading countries, with the hope of eventually producing a sophisticated combat aircraft. As an illustration, India manufactured MiG-21 fighters under license from the Soviet Union from the 1970s onwards. That enabled India to build a relatively large production base for producing an aircraft, but then they hired Dassault as project management consultants, the major French aerospace company, to try to help India organize its own indigenous aircraft project. And the result of that is the HAL Tejas fighter, which is just entering service now after nearly 30 years of development. It's behind schedule and over budget. India also tried a similar project strategy in their first attempt to break into this market. Argentina attempted it in the 1940s. Egypt attempted it. It's a pretty classic strategy of trying to bring in foreign expertise in project management or design expertise. The second strategy is one of starting with a precursor industry, then building competence by designing a less sophisticated aircraft, either a jet trainer and or a ground attack aircraft, and then moving up from that to trying to build a cutting-edge combat aircraft. Now, a good example of that is Taiwan's combat aircraft industry. Taiwan began in 1973 manufacturing US-designed F-5s under license. That's 6 years before South Korea began manufacturing the same aircraft under license. Then they moved to an indigenously designed trainer aircraft, the AT-3, before finally producing the indigenous defense fighter, the FCK-1, otherwise known as the Qingguo, in the 1990s. So a number of countries have pursued this strategy as well. And the third strategy is one of first starting with the production of a foreign designed aircraft, then gradually incorporating domestic improvements, modifications to it, before finally transitioning to producing a cutting-edge aircraft on one's own. A good illustration of this is the Israeli case, which you brought up earlier. The Israelis began the unlicensed production of French Mirage 5s in 1971. Then they added a new engine and the canards to the front of the aircraft, as well as new avionics, producing a derived aircraft known as the Kafir, which they produced from 1976. And then finally they moved on to try to develop a cutting-edge combat aircraft in the 1980s, and ultimately decided for reasons of economies of scale that it was unviable and canceled the project in 1987. So these are the 3 ideal typical ways that countries have tried to move from being non-aircraft producers to developing sophisticated combat aircraft production capabilities. In many respects, the South Korean experience is a hybrid of several of these models. And from that point of view, it embodies many of the lessons learned in past capabilities. by starting out with a trainer ground attack aircraft like the TA-50, it embodies elements of the second strategy, bringing in design skills from Lockheed Martin, potentially from McDonnell Douglas on the KFX. It embodies elements of the first strategy as well. So it's very much in keeping with previous, it's a hybrid of previous strategies that employed trying to develop sophisticated combat aircraft industries. Now, despite the fact that a lot of these programs were very well designed and executed over time with with reasonable engineering skills behind them, the track record still is one of most of the countries deciding to exit the market after trying for a substantial amount of time to enter it. And this brings us to what are the major obstacles to success? Why is it the case that at least 17 out of these 20 projects can be classified as failures? The first one is that at some point in their development, a country trying to break into the combat aircraft market faces a substantial trade-off between autonomy, the autonomy provided by pursuing the national project, and efficiency. Because usually the aircraft produced by new entrants are cost ineffective in the first generation, which means that the domestic consumer is loath to purchase them and exports are difficult to find. You know, a very good example of this is the Israeli Kafir. The Israelis in the mid-1970s had developed a substantially modified and improved aircraft based on the French design of the Mirage 5 dating back to the 1960s. Now, what the Israelis managed to do with the Kafir was remarkable in the extent that it was a much improved version of the Mirage 5. The problem, though, is that it came into production in the mid-1970s at a time when the top 5 aircraft producers had moved on to a new generation technology. So the Kafir all of a sudden found itself in competition with F-16s, F-4s, Mirage 2000s, Mirage F-1s, which basically meant that not only was it difficult to export the Kafir, ultimately they were exported to Ecuador and Sri Lanka, but it was also difficult to convince the Israeli Air Force to buy them. A lot of Kafirs were produced and essentially were produced to keep the assembly line open, but immediately went into storage. Never saw service because they were considered to be cost ineffective compared to the F-16s that the Israeli Air Force could buy from the United States for a comparable price, but providing greater capabilities. So the efficiency autonomy trade-off is a real trade-off that these entrants have faced, and it's usually meant that new entrants have had a very difficult time finding adequate economies of scale, both because they can't find exports and because the domestic consumer also frequently would prefer to import a more sophisticated foreign-produced aircraft. So on this chart, I've laid out the 7 of the new entrant aircraft projects that had the highest production rates, comparing those to the right-hand column of equivalent aircraft produced by the 5 historic aircraft producers, and in this case it's actually 3 historic aircraft producers because I have not included US or Soviet Russian production runs, which are even larger. So if you compare these production runs, on average, equivalent types of aircraft, the existing market-leading companies had production runs 4 times as large as the new entrants, which obviously had catastrophic impacts for economies of scale. By the way, in my own interviews with European aircraft manufacturers, it's usually considered that 500 is around the minimum number of aircraft you want to produce in a production run for that aircraft's design, development, and production to be considered viable. So in that case, most of the traditional producers have achieved or appear that they might be able to achieve that production runs that size, whereas almost all of the new entrant projects fall far short of that. Combat aircraft are also extremely R&D intensive. I don't know what the South Korean defense R&D budget is at the moment, but I saw figures dating from about 5 years ago stating that it was around $1.5 billion a year for purely R&D. And if one looks at fifth generation R&D on aircraft seems to run between 37 and 49 billion an aircraft, whereas even if one goes a generation earlier and is willing to sort of sub-optimize with fourth generation aircraft, the R&D spends are still between 3 and 23 billion dollars per aircraft. So these are extremely R&D intensive projects which require tremendous investments. And these investments also require tremendous continuity over time. One of the biggest problems that new entrants have faced is the challenge of keeping production lines open and design teams employed. Because if you cease giving a design team new projects, the project management and design skills needed to design a combat aircraft are perishable skills. So, for example, India in the early 1960s imported in 18 German aircraft engineers, led by Kurt Tank, who was the chief designer for Focke-Wulf during World War II. Now, these 18 Germans moved to India and integrated with a lot of very skilled Indian aerospace engineers and sort of created a design team which trained up the Indian engineers in the techniques of project management and the management of a large development project. It was reasonably successful. By 1965, the combined design team had achieved a certain level of skills, but then there was no follow-up project to the Marut fighter until the mid-1980s. So when India decided to launch its new indigenous aircraft project in 1984, they discovered that there was no aerospace engineer who had been involved in the previous project who would remain employed, who was at a stage in their career that they would be able to see through the development of the Tejas fighter. And this is a problem that Japan and Taiwan are both facing, in that Taiwan's production line for the Chingguo went dead in 1999, and I think Japan's production line for the Mitsubishi F2 basically closed in 2011. So without follow-on projects, the question is do these design skills really remain? And the historic evidence is probably not. And then finally, there's the fact that if the objective of creating your own combat aircraft project is autonomy, all of these projects show that autonomy is extremely relative. Because even if states have developed some capabilities for designing and producing combat aircraft, there's a lot of technological bottlenecks that mean that you're still dependent on foreign components. The biggest one is jet engines. No attempt to break into the jet engine market has been successful since the 1950s. So on the left we have the Indian Kaveri project. This was an attempt launched in the 1980s with a lot of resources to try to develop a turbofan engine that would be competitive for combat aircraft. It failed. The Tejas fighters powered by American engine. On the right is the Chinese project, the WS-10, which doesn't appear to be in operation, but has had a lot invested in it in the recent past. But it appears as though newly produced J-11s and J-10s are still being powered by imported Russian engines. So there's technological bottlenecks that means that even if you develop a national aircraft, chances are that you're going to depend on international suppliers for the engines and avionics, which also is going to limit your possibilities to export that aircraft and to therefore achieve economies of scale. So, all of these reasons help explain why the vast majority of attempts to break into the combat aircraft market up until present have failed. Now, my own research, which is largely focused on globalization, looks at how the overall structure of the international defense industry is changing as a result of both the globalization of supply chains as well as the creation of multinational defense corporations that exist in either multiple countries or have equity ties linking them across international boundaries. And the question is what has that changed? And I think that offers a small number of opportunities for new entrants to do things in ways that were not available to countries that were trying to enter this market in the 1960s or 1970s. And the first opportunity that presents itself is the fact that with digitally managed supply chains, it's theoretically possible for a smaller country to design and produce aircraft relying much more on imported components and components drawn from a really global base of suppliers. And this can reduce costs in a pretty dramatic fashion. Saab has been the leader in this respect. Saab in the mid-1980s discovered that with the escalating cost of combat aircraft, it would be impossible for a country of Sweden's size to continue going it alone in the development of aircraft. So therefore, Saab invested a lot of money in researching how do you manage a global supply chain for combat aircraft. And what they achieved with the Gripen was ultimately deriving 50% of the Gripen's value from that global supply chain. And as a result of that, Saab was able to develop the Gripen for, roughly speaking, $3 billion in research and development, which is less than a quarter the next cheapest aircraft of the fourth generation, which was the French Rafale that had a development cost of $13 billion. The Gripen NG new generation has pushed this even further, deriving 70% of its value from the global supply chain, only 30% being produced in Sweden. And in a way that what Textron has attempted to do with its private venture Scorpion fighter is similar. Basically, focusing on the core competence of having a design team capable of managing a project and deriving much of the equipment from overseas suppliers or from commercial off-the-shelf products. The Gripen up above shows you how what a globalized supply chain for a combat aircraft looks like. If you look, a lot of this avionic engine subcomponents are not produced in Sweden. They are American, German, French, British in origin. So this means that Sweden, and most of these were off-the-shelf products that were developed by other countries for use in their indigenous aircraft. So Sweden did not have to invest money in the research and development of those components and didn't have to develop that supply base. Down below is the Textron Scorpion, also showing how Textron has managed, with a peak of 200 individuals in the design team, of designing on a relatively small budget a ground attack aircraft with a lot of commercial off-the-shelf components and imported components. Most of the cockpit electronics come from Cobham in the United Kingdom.
Mark.
Yes.
What does Saab get out of this?
What does Saab get out of this?
Yeah, if 7% comes from international sourcings, right?
Well, Saab remains within the market.
Have you looked into the so-called profit configuration of Saab in selling this Gripen?
it's very difficult with any of these producers to get into their cost functions, largely because the costs, the margins are something they don't want to reveal to their own domestic consumers. Now, my interviews with Saab have indicated that Saab has had to change its business model. They derive much less of their profit from the Gripen than they did in previous generations from the Viggen or from the Draken. But rather, Saab has had to diversify its business model and sort of leverage the systems integrating capabilities that they've maintained through projects like the Gripen and achieve much more of their margins on products like airborne early warning systems and missiles. I will also show in the next slide also what Saab is trying to do in terms of lowering its costs, potentially in trying to improve this profit margin. Another thing, Saab's always an interesting case to look at because it's the smallest of the major aircraft producers that still has maintained the capability of managing a project of this scale. So that's meant that they've had to be one of the most adaptive in terms of figuring out ways of leveraging global dynamics. One thing that Saab has done, and that's possible for other aircraft industries but that have not plunged into it yet, is outsourcing a lot of basic engineering tasks on a global basis. One of the problems Saab traditionally had was the very high prices of engineering man-hours in Sweden. But what Saab discovered is Saab in the 1990s acquired a South African subsidiary, and Saab has pioneered using CATIA digital computer-assisted design software of basically outsourcing a lot of basic engineering tasks to the South African subsidiary, which then could share designs in real time between Linköping in Sweden and the South African subsidiary as a way of reducing engineering costs on projects. So it's possible to distribute the design of systems in a way that was never possible before with computer-assisted design. And this has also made it possible for some of the traditional aircraft industries to develop a side business of project management or design assistance for emerging markets. So, for example, Dassault led this in basically providing a lot of the initial design material and project management advice for the Yugoslav project of the 1980s, the Novi Avion, which Saab basically designed as a miniature version of Saab's Rafale. And Saab has done a similar thing recently, basically taking a contract to provide an initial design for Turkey's TFX fighter project. So in a way, with digital design tools, it's also possible for the project managing firms to develop a niche of providing basic design assistance to other to developing companies as well. Now, well, globalized supply chains and digital design platforms make it possible for distributing the production and design of aircraft in new ways. It's also worth mentioning that while these might make it more possible for small and medium-sized states to break into the combat market aircraft, most of the success that these states have had in defense aerospace has not been in combat aircraft. In combat aircraft, there is a real obstacle to getting into the market, which is simply the R&D intensity and the difficulties of systems integration and establishing oneself as a new entrant. So therefore, defense industries in small and medium-sized countries have been most successful when they've worked on products where product runs are small and manufacturing is flexible, where products are tailored to individual customers, and where incremental innovation as opposed to radical generational shifts in innovation predominate. So this explains why, in contrast to larger states, smaller states as aerospace industries have really taken leading roles in sectors like UAVs. Israel today supplies 41% of the world's UAV export market. Airborne early warning. Both Saab and Israeli companies have essentially cornered a lot of the international market for airborne early warning systems. Upgrades. Most of the large packages to upgrade aircraft are coming out of small and medium-sized states as defense industries. And finally, missiles. So it might be the case that the most profitable place for a medium-sized state trying to pursue a defense aerospace capability would not be in combat aircraft itself, but would be in these other areas where production runs are smaller, production is more flexible, and products are more tailored, and therefore economies of scope and economies of scale are less important than in large combat aircraft. So just briefly to conclude before I get your feedback and questions, combat aircraft remain an extremely difficult sector to enter. The historic track record is miserable. 20-some attempts have been made to enter this market. Only one appears to be a qualified success. Increasingly global supply chains mean that self-sufficiency is becoming illusory for even the largest countries. So, with globalization, even American or British combat aircraft have a very high percentage of foreign components. So if you're trying to build a combat aircraft for the purpose of autonomy might be something that is disappearing as possible even for the largest states. Nevertheless, embracing globalization through globalized supply chains and globalizing your R&D process does offer possibilities for designing aircraft and producing aircraft much more efficiently than was the case previously. However, the best opportunities for small and medium-sized states probably reside in aerospace products other than combat aircraft. So, thanks a lot for this opportunity to present my research to you.
Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. I think that he has given us a lot of food for thought. I think there are a lot of provocative questions. I think Daniel Kingston seems to be raising a question. Dan?
Just kind of quick clarification question. I was curious, you said that Israel has 41% of UAV market, the global market. Is that for military use or all applications? And
That's military exported UAVs. Obviously, the largest